Okay, let's start. And I'm going to start with some information that I should have started every class section with. So here we go. The last few Sundays, we have not ended on time. And so
are we being chastised?
no, I'm just suggesting we need to be careful that time does fly.
Okay.
And we must end on time. And so I've set my alarm for 10:10, which means we've got 5 minutes after that to wrap everything up. So when you hear this little jingle go off, you know we're about at the end. Then I just want to repeat. I don't know we've ever said this piece by piece about discussion in class. And so I want to add some guidelines and make it perfectly clear that when an author makes statements, you're free to challenge it. You know, heard Paul and Jane and others say, we don't always agree with Amy Jill Levine. We don't always agree with Elaine Pagels. And you're free to disagree. You know, we bring in this material, and whether it's a Community of Christ author, an RLDS author, or someone else, you know, you don't have to accept what is on the written page. You can disagree. So I think you know that, but I want to say it up front. But we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, if you find something you dislike in a chapter or a particular book, hopefully you will consider other information that is available in that chapter or in that book. And the obvious conclusion may not be correct. Sometimes we do jump to conclusions, and sometimes those are not correct. And we need to ponder or consider the issue before reaching a conclusion. So, for what it's worth. And finally, discussion is encouraged. You know, please feel free to interrupt me, to say something that is bothering you or troubling you, but please also keep your remarks brief and to the point, because there may be other people who want to participate. So, is that all comfortable? Anybody want to disagree with those guidelines?
Shouldn't wait for 45 minutes when we make it.
Yes, yeah. Save that for another time. So, okay. Then I want to go to my recollection of some of the comments at the end of class last week, and I want to address those. And if I'm misremembering, please correct me. But I heard that this book is fracturing faith, that it's encouraging nihilism and not spirituality. It's propagating the idea that there's no right or wrong answer, that there's all these shades in between. And you get to the point where you can't believe anything. So, have I missed anything, or is that too far off base?
Well, I might have been the cause of some of those ideas, but I don't. I want to just state clearly that I don't know that it's this specific book that is causing that, but just the last. Well, the nihilism is just something that's kind of in the air, so to speak, and certain books bring it out more. Okay. And I don't know, because I've only gotten 2 chapters into this one. I don't know what the conclusions are going to be. But I guess yesterday I was just very apprehensive about what some people call deconstructing faith, when there's no attempt at reconstructing it.
Okay.
So,
okay.
It's kind of like, to me, it's kind of like when modern movies, the whole idea is, let's flip the script. Let's flip the script. Let's change, change the tropes. And it's like, okay, but what are we actually doing here? So I guess that was my
replace it. Yeah. Okay. Well, just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to bore you with some definitions. Okay. So what's the biblical definition of faith? You want a hint?
Sure.
Okay. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. That's from Hebrew. And that's the National New American Standard Bible. And I've used that one because throughout this, I've used NASB because, rather than NIV or others, because it's rated as being more closely with the Greek, more accurate translation, even than the NIV, King James, whatever. And I thought we might be interested in knowing what the inspired version and the King James version say. And the inspired version says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And King James simply substitutes a substance for assurance. Okay, so what's the Merriam-Webster definition of faith? Well, I won't keep you in suspense. It's an allegiance to a person or a duty or a person, fidelity to one's promises. In other words, we act in good faith. It's a belief and trust in loyalty and to God. And so all this ties in with fracturing our faith, because the main thing is it's a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. And as we go through, especially the Gnostic Gospels and any of the Gospels, we're going to find that there are statements for which there is no proof. It's something that we need to accept on faith until we find evidence to the contrary. So it's something that faith is something that is believed, especially with strong conviction. And I know last week Jim talked about the faith he has based on his childhood memories and teaching. And that's a strongly held conviction. And nothing we're doing here is meant to interfere with those convictions. We're simply throwing information out and saying, you consider what you believe to be true or not true. Okay. And then nihilism, in case you're wondering, is the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated, often associated with extreme pessimism and a radical skepticism that condemns existence. And that is prevalent today. I see it among a lot of young people, and of course, anybody younger than me is a young person. Nihilism states that there's no sustainer, such as God, lasting purpose, meaning, or hope for human life, even if humans create their own transitory purpose, meaning, or hope. So in other words, even if we create something temporarily, it's not sustained. And finally, Christianity condemns nihilism. And I'm coming to this because I wasn't sure how much the comments last Sunday addressed this particular book, but I just wanted to be clear. Christianity condemns nihilism as intrinsically opposed to its own essential feature, which include a meaningful universe that is best grasped by faith, hope, and love. Does anybody, that last paragraph, anybody disagree with any part of that? That's Christianity stands for.
Should have put joy in there.
Mhm.
We could add that.
We'll have that.
Other comments?
Well, the one thing that I've been interested in this book here is which is also in other places in the New Testament, that the kingdom of God is within you. So you just have to look for it and find it, so forth. Because one thing that has bothered me has been if Jesus is the only way to get to heaven, what about all the people who lived before Jesus? And what about all the people who never heard of Jesus? And I don't think that God would condemn them to hell, since I have met the devil and he is not a very nice guy. So that I think that's this idea of having the kingdom within you, that you can discover it technically on your own, is something that I found interesting in this book so far.
And we're going to address that even a little bit more shortly here. Any other comments before I move on? Okay, herein lies the controversy. The author says certain Christian leaders from the 2nd century through the 4th century came to reject many sources of revelation and construct instead the New Testament gospel canon of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, along with the canon of truth, which became the nucleus of the later creeds that have defined Christianity today. What is she saying there? That anything that bothers you?
Well, I don't know what is specifically meant by many sources of revelation, but throwing out, well, I guess they're not saying all sources, just certain. I find that kind of a little bothering because then we don't necessarily have access to make our own determination or maybe pick out things that are useful.
Okay. And I think that's the phrase that is somewhat bothersome. And we're going to get into that even a little bit more, but I just want you to realize that that's where the controversy lies. Was there a time in the 2nd through the 4th century when certain sources, quote, of revelation, were discarded in favor of others?
Well, that, Jonathan,
Yes.
that's revealed in the Nag Hammadi discovery. All these other gospels that are not in the New Testament.
Okay.
There were other beliefs and perspectives that are not presented in the New Testament.
Okay. So the canon of truth became those books that were in the canon, what became Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and others were discarded. And when we talk about, the Gospel of Thomas is one that was discarded. So the question becomes always, and I go back to Quarles' comment, are we missing something because it was discarded? Is there something in here that we have missed in Matthew, Luke, and John?
Well, and I've read Elaine Pagels' book before and read the Gospel of Thomas then, and there were some things that I found that if I had known as a child might have saved me a lot of grief, such as instead of being perfect, you do the best you can. And since only God is perfect, I never understood how I was supposed to be perfect.
Well, and the other thing, remember earlier we talked about, as we go through and discuss this, we need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Gospel of Thomas talks about multiple gods. I don't buy that. It also talks about the answer. There's a spark of God within each of us, and we find those answers by looking within. I buy that. So the point is, it goes back to the old RLDS term, discernment. It's probably a community of Christ term too. We have to discern as we read these books what we believe is true and what we don't. Okay. Hegel suggests with other Bible scholars that the Gospel of John was written to oppose the Gospel of Thomas and his followers. Okay. And there are many scholars who believe that John in about 90 to 100 AD was writing because of the Gnostics and other groups trying to say, no, you're wrong. This is what the gospel is about. This is what the story of Jesus is all about. So one of the things that struck me as I was looking at the Gnostic Gospels is that RLDS view that at one time there was a pure church as constructed by Jesus. And it included 70s and bishops and, deacons and all those that are mentioned in the New Testament. So I went back and I know, I don't know if that bothers any of you or not, that supposedly there's one true church back then, and yet we've got the Gnostics and we've got the Petrins and we've got the Johannians and we've got the Paulines. Yeah, and the Gnostics.
Well, they were so spread out. I mean, they didn't have modern communication, so they would kind of develop their own thread, I would think, depending on the area they lived in.
And depending who the teacher was.
Yes.
And I find that acceptable now. But in my younger years, I really believe that Joseph Smith was restoring, and you can disagree with it, was restoring the one true church as designed by Jesus when he was on earth. And to me, it seems now that there were a variety of communities that responded to the message of Jesus. And you don't have to believe me anymore than you have to believe Elaine Pagels. So, but I did want to go back and show that, restorationism is not just a Community of Christ LDS belief. There are other restorationist churches. Our brand of it, I believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. He was chosen to restore the primitive apostolic church established by Jesus. And by apostolic church, we mean the one that was led by the apostles. Like other restoration groups, believe the church and priesthood established by Jesus were withdrawn from the earth. How many of you have heard that? Probably in your younger years.
Yeah,
Withdrawn from the earth.
I heard that back in the 90s.
After the end of the apostolic age, so in other words, after all the apostles had passed away, and before the first council of Nicaea in 325. Okay, that's a restorationist belief.
Jonathan?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I never heard the 325 of the first council of Nicaea. I always heard it was 1280 years before 1830, whenever that was. I forget how they came up with that, but there was something in Revelations was what I heard based. So it was later than what you're saying, but anyway, it was similar.
Okay. Mine's based on that totally authoritative source, Wikipedia. So you may be right, Dennis. Other reformers based their movements on their biblical interpretations. In other words, they looked at the Bible, they had different interpretations, which they believed took the church back or restored that primitive church. Smith and Cowdery, I think you know those two names, Joseph and Oliver, held that they were visited by John the Baptist to receive the Aaronic priesthood, which is from which we believe our priesthood authority comes. The church has believed that over the years. The Restoration authorized members to receive revelation from God to restore the original apostolic organization lost after the events of the New Testament. Any comments on that? Yes.
I looked at, and the original Nicene Creed of 325, so I think there were later. Oh, I don't want to download that. That came from Christ the Savior.
Okay.
But I also saw it in a couple other places.
Okay. And the reason again that I'm going through all of this is the contrast, the concept that there were Gnostic groups, Johannians, Petrins, Paulines, and not just one original church that was unified across all of Christendom. Not talking about during the apostolic age when the apostles were still alive. So you have to decide, was there one apostolic church established by Jesus Christ? Or were there multiple communities of believers? Any comments?
Well, it all depends on whether you consider Peter as the originator or carried on the original church, and all the rest of them were kind of split offs, sort of thing. With,
Okay.
And were not part of the original church.
Okay.
So
Jim?
I don't know what some of these other groups believe, but I know that the Gnostics were kind of far out.
Okay. Jim, you had a comment?
Jonathan?
Oh,
Yeah, 1 second. Let
anyway,
Jim go.
of course, the Catholics always told everyone that St. Peter was the first pope and that the Catholic, Universal Catholic Church, that was established by Jesus. Of course, that's what they believe.
I think Catholic in that, with the small c sort of means universal, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
yes, it does. Was there a comment online?
Yeah, this is Paul. I went to a Mormon website and they described the apostasy as occurring after Jesus ascended into heaven and after all of the original 12 apostles were dead and gone. So, mid to late first century, probably.
Okay.
I think Joseph Smith's belief about the apostasy away from the original structure of the church presumes that the church was highly organized very early on, and that's probably just not the case. Paul was still establishing the church and trying to set up churches in different cities and put people in charge, but the idea that there was a structure with deacons, priests, teachers, elders, high priests, and so forth is just, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine something like that. So I don't know how to add that into the conversation other than to say that the church was very young at the time that Joseph Smith proclaimed it to be an apostasy. Hundreds of years later, yeah, maybe so, when there was organization and there were bishops established and so forth, and there was a lot of corruption. We've seen that when we studied Christian history. So I'm just throwing that out there for consideration.
Sure. And the last book we studied talked about the Petrines and the Paulines, and that there was a split even there between whether the kingdom of God had come already with Jesus or whether it was in the future, and there were other distinguishing factors between the two groups. So to me, it is not inconceivable that after the lifetime of Jesus, in a very short period of time, that there were lots of ideas floated around. And I think that's why there is the Council of Nicaea, and the other councils were meant to unify the church, to come up with, say, okay, this is what we believe. And unfortunately, the process, one group became heretical, another group became heretical, and only the winners wrote the history. So, and my answer, and I think the answer based on the last two books we've read, is that they're Petrine communities, they're Pauline communities, Johannian communities, and Gnostic communities, and more. Okay.
Thomasine communities.
Yes. Yes. I should have included that since we're reading
What did he say?
the Gospel of Thomas.
Oh.
Thomasine communities. Well, I tried to pull you into a parallel with our own church, and ask the question: has the RLDS Community of Christ had to unify the church at certain stages in its history by declaring certain information or acts as not authorized? Have we done that? And if so, give me some examples.
Baptism of the dead.
Baptism of the dead, or for the dead, either
For
way.
the dead, yeah.
Jim?
Of course, 1860, when the brothers came to visit Joe the Third and pleaded with him to take over leadership.
Mhm.
So to get rid of polygamy and all those other things.
Right. Yep. the innuendo, whether you believe Joseph Smith participated in polygamy or not, there it was clearly some practices of polygamy in Nauvoo. And so that's another correction that had to be made, was to reject that. And that's what Joseph Smith III definitely did. Other course corrections you can think of.
Enforcing of the word of wisdom on the way to Utah.
Okay. Enforcing of the word of wisdom. And even how much of the word of wisdom do we practice today, those of you who got coffee this morning?
Or tea.
Or tea.
Other than herbal.
Yeah.
Probably now or not.
There's another comment.
That just says hot drinks are not for the belly. It doesn't specify coffee, so iced coffee is okay.
As is iced tea, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, legalism.
Well, the list I came up with was baptism for the dead, members prophesying for the whole church. Because there have been times when people who were not authorized to speak for the entire church did so. And I can remember, even as a pastor in West Virginia, one time I had to shut down an individual who was prophesying, and I could tell it was inappropriate. I knew it was inappropriate. Women in the priesthood. And the changing of the tithing law. 10% of all you owned, 10% of your surplus to whatever you want to give. And purposes of the temple. I can remember as a child hearing about how when the temple was finally built, there would be all these sacred ordinances performed in the temple. And now we've defined that to be educational and peace oriented. So that's even changed somewhat. And the whole point of all that is to say that over time, the church changes. And certain things become acceptable and certain things become unacceptable, or at least on the outside of mainstream. So finally getting to the author, would you like to talk about chapter 2?
Yeah.
Here are some contrasting views between John and Thomas. And we'll later talk about contrasting views between the Synoptic Gospels and John. But to start out with, here's John saying, many other signs, attesting miracles, Jesus performed, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. What does that tell you? What's the essence of Christianity?
That you have to come through Jesus.
Yeah, you have to come through Jesus, and the essence of Christianity is simply to believe in Jesus.
Mhm.
Okay. That John doesn't mention a lot about works. It's believing in Jesus. Jesus said to him, and this is from John 14:6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There's only one way. And finally, the author says, John was an effort to unify the church. Just as the church councils later on were to unify the church, John was an effort, the author says, to unify the church at the end of the first century. So let's take a look at Thomas. God's light shines not only in Jesus, but potentially in everyone. Is that an alien concept to members of the Community of Christ? No. Okay. Seek to know God through one's own divinely given capacity, since all are created in the image of God. Is that an alien concept for members of the Community of Christ?
I'm not sure what it means, but seek to know God through one's own divinely given.
I think as we're moving toward becoming a people who share the prophetic initiative, that passage from Thomas becomes more and more true all the time for us.
To me, it says through our intellect, through our own reasoning. Chris, Coral, you got
That's
something?
okay. Yeah, I was going to say that we have the ability to start the process. We aren't dictated to about how to approach God. I mean, it seemed like the early Catholics, you had to go to the priest in order to know what God was about. And as you grow and as you pursue the spirituality within you, I think is what allows you to, well, that's how you grow, is what I would say. I may be saying it badly.
My wife, who was brought up Catholic, tells me that when she was going through catechism, they discouraged them from reading the Bible. That everything came from the priest. Thomas is saying you need to explore yourself on your own. Now, that can be a problem
It's more like
because
Martin Luther.
anyhow, the emphasis is on each person's search for God, not on unifying the church.
Well, and even part of our belief system was not only the Bible, but the Doctrine of and Covenants, but all good books.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the pendulum sways back and forth, and what you described about the priest discouraging reading of the Bible. Initially, I thought, oh, that's really quite severe. But then I realized that actually there is some wisdom to that. But I think that goes to the other extreme, because when you can interpret, this isn't the Bible, but I'm holding it up. When you can interpret scripture to mean anything you want it to be, theoretically, when you can twist scripture around, then everybody is a theologian. When everybody is a theologian, you can defend anything, and it gets really off the rails. So where is that unifying principle? You talked about having to correct somebody who is prophesying for the whole church, and I could say, well, what gives you the right? That's his experience, that's his lived experience. So there's got to be some corrective.
Well, what I didn't say was I was a pastor at the time. He was prophesying about my wife.
Oh.
And so I knew that what he was saying was inaccurate. So anyhow, such is life. So.
Well, part of the corrective is when you meet as a community to kind of share your different views, somebody else can point some weaknesses in your thinking. We all are theologians, whether we want to admit it or not.
Yeah, we're probably all amateur theologians.
Everybody's an amateur theologian. Some of them get a degree, but they don't really know the answer.
Well, and the other thing that occurred to me while Ryan was talking is that, I agree, we can't all interpret. You can't interpret out of context, I guess is what I want to say. And I see a lot of people who seem to do that. Every time I see a quote in an article or I hear a quote from the Bible, I always want to read at least a few verses before and a few verses after to see what the context is. And I do believe that God has given us the intellectual capability to explore God, the scriptures on our own, preferably with a group like this, but if necessary, on our own, and come up with an understanding. That goes back to what Thomas is talking about, that spark of the divinity, which is in each of us, but I do believe. So Thomas goes on, he's got a number of sayings, and we're only going to hit a couple of them today. And by the way, for those who came in late, I've set my alarm for 10 minutes after 10, and that's our early warning that we have to be out of here 5 minutes after that. We have to correct this overtime issue we've had lately. Which doesn't mean I want to cut back on discussion. I want you to please discuss, but when the alarm goes off, it means you've got 5 minutes. So Thomas says, Jesus says, if those who seek to attract you say to you, see the kingdom is in heaven, then the birds of heaven will be there before you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will be there before you. But the kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will know that it is you who are the sons of the Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you will be in a state of poverty, and it is you, the poverty, and other interpretations say you will be in poverty. So he's basically saying what? Don't let the birds get there first. Don't let the fish get there first.
That it's all around us,
Pardon?
that it's all around us and within us.
Yes, yes.
And I will say, yes, if you do not know yourself, then it's harder to find things.
So I think the important part is that center sentence that says, but the kingdom is within you and it is outside of you. And when you know yourselves, then you will be known. And it's interesting, just a side note, the Greek version only says within you. The Coptic version of the same says within you and it is outside you. So the Coptics or the Egyptian Christians were a little bit more expansive than the Greeks.
That's interesting, because I can probably go along with the Coptic version. Because if it's only an inward journey, I guess where I have a lot of problem is because I've had to struggle with depression throughout most of my life. And what seems to make my depression worse is when I turn inward, when it's me looking at myself, and the outside world dissolves away and it's just my inward journey. That's where I get the most depressed. But when I look outside of myself and I look towards others and, the transcendent, look beyond, and, it's possible I'm talking on a different level here, but I just.
Well, I think you're making a good argument for having adult Sunday school class.
Yeah, no,
Well, yeah.
struggled with depression too most of my life. And it seems like finally, at least for a while, I've been able to finally dispel it, because when I would look inward, I would see all the bad in me. And so it would just make it worse and I would just continue to spiral.
Like a distorted mirror.
Yeah, but at some point I was, maybe with the last medication they put me on, which helped my brain to just kind of relax when I went to bed so I could sleep. It seemed to break that cycle, and now I'm able to look within me without having that distorted mirror. I still see parts of it, but I'm also able to delve deeper within myself as far as my spiritual practices.
And I would go back to the point that we are a community of Christ.
Yeah.
And that community is in our title purposefully. Because we need a community of believers to support us in our study as well as our worship. I do want to point out there's a parallel from the Jewish Apocrypha. In the book of Baruch, it says, has anyone climbed up to heaven and found wisdom? Has anyone returned with her from the clouds? Has anyone crossed the sea and discovered her? Has anyone purchased her with gold coin? And so it seems to be the same sort of thing. And some scholars equate wisdom with God. very synonymous terms. So, John's defenders called it the Logos Gospel. That is the gospel of divine reason, or the word, logos meaning the word. Those who opposed it were irrational, lacking reason, alogos. So who do you think was alogos? Maybe anyone who didn't agree with John.
You would seem so.
Yeah. And Thomas was obviously, again, this is part of that case that's constructed saying that John was written to combat some of the Gnostic beliefs that were prevalent at that point in time.
Jonathan,
Yes.
to me, the word logos, a Greek word, to me shows that Greek philosophy is entering into their belief system.
Yep, and I think that's very accurate. Pagels points out that at crucial moments, John's gospel directly contradicts the combined testimony of the synoptic, or the synoptic meaning seen together, gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. She goes into some of those contradictions, which we'll deal with. Pagels says some of these differences are more than variations on a theme. Now, here's one of the places where I disagree with Pagels, and you can agree or disagree with her. I think some of the contrasts between John and the synoptics are minimalistic, are minor and inconsequential. So let's take a look. If we deal with the temple money changes. In the synoptic gospels, Jesus' last public act is driving the money changers out of the temple. It finally drove the chief priest and allies to arrest Jesus, according to the synoptics. And the chief priest and the scribes heard this, and they began seeking how to put him to death. This is from Mark 11:18. For they were afraid of him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. So, in essence, Matthew 21:42-46 repeats that concern that the crowd supports Jesus and they have to put him to death. But it's that offered after a couple of parables, one of which is, in fact, I'll read it. It says, Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in the scriptures, quote, the stone which the builders erected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. But on whomever he falls, it will scatter him like dust." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood he was talking about them. When they sought to seize him, they feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet. And the whole gist of that is that in the Synoptic Gospels, the money changer episode is at the very end. It's the last public act, which causes
The last straw.
Yeah, exactly. The last straw before the Pharisees take him and crucify him. Okay. So let's contrast.
I would say Romans.
Well, okay, Romans or, well, it was the Pharisees who really, the high priest who put him to death or captured him, wanted him to be taken before the Romans. Are you disagreeing with that?
They had a trial, but the Romans crucified Jesus.
Oh, okay. At the behest of who?
All the people.
Yeah.
Crucified him.
Okay.
Romans were implicitly involved with all that. It wasn't just the Jews.
Oh, no, I agree with you on that. I'm simply saying that particular verse talks about the Pharisees and his parables and it frightened them and threatened them. And that's what instigated the long march to the crucifixion. Any other comment, Dennis? I don't want to cut you off.
Nope, running out of time.
Okay, we are. Okay, so in John, Jesus' first public act is driving the money changers out of the temple. And Pagels says Jesus' whole mission was to purify and transform the worship of God. And it was a more violent event. He takes a scourge, a whip to him, and drives them out. And there were no immediate repercussions to the event. So here's Matthew and Mark, and in square brackets you find Mark's inserts into Matthew's comments. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and of course Mark adds grounds, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And at this point, Mark also inserts and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts, which is a little different than Matthew and Luke. And he said to them, or began to teach, "It is written, my house it shall be called a house of prayer." And Mark adds for all nations, but you are making it a robber's den, and other variations say den of robbers. So that's Mark and Matthew and Luke. And John says, the Passover was near. Jesus went to Jerusalem, and you realize that this is a second Passover story. This is early in John's record. And at the very end, of course, it's Passover when Jesus is taken and crucified. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables, and he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place or a house of business." So you can see a little bit difference between the two. But John's is, again, the last, is the first event early in his scripture, and Matthew, Mark late. Now, is that consequential to you folks? Could be, but is it?
Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe, could be,
Well,
sort of.
I mean, it's either the first or the last thing. I mean,
This is the
it would
last straw
seem
that
that
was,
it's to the priest, it would be a heretical act.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think that his ministry would have been much shorter.
Yeah.
So
Any comments from the peanut gallery back there?
Well, it makes you wonder whether, one of the views is that this is what caused him to be put on trial, and the other one is it happened, but it didn't really raise a lot of tackle. So it's not really, I don't know whether it makes a difference in how much consequence there was.
Well, Pagels basically says this is a variation on the theme. This is a significant difference. And I don't see it as a significant difference. I'm just personal. Jim?
Well, in fact, Jesus' first public act was at the big wedding party when he turned the jugs of water into wine. That was his first public act. Well, this had to be one of his last, because shortly after that, they came and arrested him you know, the temple guards to bring him before the Sanhedrin. So, well, actually, the turning the jugs of water into wine was the first public act.
But that's based on
Jonathan?
scripture. Yes.
You know, when we've studied Amy Jill Levine, she's kind of talked about how some of the parts of the Gospels are infused with negative feelings toward the Jews that she believes, you know, led to a lot of persecution of the Jewish people over many centuries. I wonder if putting this, and John was more notorious for that than the Synoptic Gospels. I wonder if putting this at the very beginning kind of sets the tone for how he's going to present, you know, the high priests and Judaism, as opposed to leaving it at the end like the Synoptics did.
I think that's a real possibility. Let me move on to another difference, and you decide if this is significant. Story of Lazarus is only in John, only the Gospel of John, and it goes, many Jews came to Mary and saw what he had done, believed in him, but some of them went to the Pharisees. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council. What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs, and that signs is sometimes replaced with miracles. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. So in other words, Jesus has to die rather than the whole nation perish because the Romans come in and take over. So that's the first part of the story of Lazarus. And then it says, Jesus 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany. By the way, the previous was after he had raised Lazarus. I should have clarified that. This one, Jesus 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him, so having dinner with him. Large crowd of Jews came, not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. That's my 5-minute warning.
Mhm.
Is it significant that that story is only in John?
Seems like it's sort of an important happening, and why would it have been omitted in Franklin?
Okay.
I don't even remember this.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know the story of Lazarus generally, but we don't, the part about the high priest wanted to kill Lazarus too.
Yeah,
I know that till I started reading it, so that tells me I need to read the scripture.
Or even that Lazarus was having supper with Jesus.
The whole reclining thing.
Reclining at the table. Now, maybe they weren't eating. Who knows?
well, that is kind of the way they ate.
Yeah.
I do think that the book of John is different enough from the synoptic gospel that it's important to know why the story. That's the difference that I wanted.
Yeah.
Why did he versus the synoptic? And synoptics means that they're all similar. That's what that word means.
They all use the same stuff.
Yeah. Mark was the original and
Cute.
But
John did not.
But there are variations even clearly between Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yes.
And so for a second, we need to step back and say, how did Mark come about? Well, it was basically an oral tradition.
Mhm.
So Mark comes along and there's this oral tradition and he says, this is an important story, this is an important story, and this is an important story. And then Matthew and Luke come along and say, well, I like that, but I need to add a little bit there, or I need to change the sequence a little bit.
Well,
Or
this is what I.
it's 5,000 rather than 3,000.
Wait, yeah.
It's a significant difference that there's a lot more emphasis on resurrection stories in John than there is in Mark. So there's clearly an evolution of how that was becoming important in the early church.
And John spends 5 chapters of Jesus talking and teaching his disciples just before his crucifixion with detail that's not available in the other. So, you know, part of it is if Coral's writing an account of this class, and Eloise is writing an account of this class, and I'm writing an account of the class, do you think they're going to be identical?
No.
Don't you think they're going to emphasize different events and even interpret those events differently? Which is maybe why we needed 4 gospels anyhow.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I don't know as much about John. So what was John's sword? Do we know?
The early church are many biblical scholars believe that John is the beloved disciple. In the book of John, it does talk about it's written by the disciple who was beloved by Jesus. Other people believe that it was written later by an unknown author.
Yeah.
And it was not uncommon, and I can't think of the term right offhand, but it was not uncommon for works in ancient history to be written in the name of someone else to give it authenticity. But the early church recognized Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So, I mean, Mark was a source and Q was a source. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar, but I mean, what was John's source material? I guess what I'm wondering.
Well, that's what Pagels would say, that he's writing in
The name of John.
in the name of John, but also writing to diminish the impact of Gnostic.
Yeah.
That he's writing as counter to what he sees as a growing Gnostic influence.
We know that John was written Peter,
Yeah.
Yes.
and so if you think about the early Christian church, that all of the debate that was going on, the book of John is the development of Christian, and they call it the apologet version.
Okay.
So it's the arguments of Christian.
Yeah.
So it's what became Christian.
Okay.
So I look at the book of John, the evolution of Christianity in that.
I think we are at time.
Yeah.
So next time we'll start with Origin of Alexandria. And if you haven't had a chance to read chapter 2, you have plenty of opportunity to do so because we're still going to be chapter 2 next week. And we may very well be chapter 2 the week after that, depending on
It's really long. Chapter 2.
who teaches after me. Because we haven't even gotten into
Yeah.
It's too long.
we haven't gotten into the whole concept that there are different terms used for Jesus, like Son of God, Son of Man, and some of the reasons why that may be. So that's on tap for next week. So come back for part 3.
Edited, but I can keep it edited.
I always have it.
Speaking of the way teachers work, I went down a rabbit hole that you guys don't want to go. I'm like, hey, how many times did he say "son of man" in the Bible? 44
Well,
times. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I used a
but
good
know.
deal of that.
Did you? Okay.
But I added to it.
I kind of went a little too far with my research, guys. I apologize.
Yeah.
Well,
You know.
I'm a person that likes rabbit holes.
Well, I was kind of fascinated by it. I didn't realize that there were so many different terms used.
Well, thank you all.
You want
We'll see you next Sunday.
to mention that or not?
easy to get me good. to
Can I
go down
include
a
this next
rabbit
Sunday?
hole.
Can I include this next Sunday? Okay.